John chapter 8 begins with a very famous encounter between Jesus and a woman who has been arrested by a lynch mob, it says, in the very act of adultery. You begin to wonder where the guy is, if she's been grabbed in the very act of adultery. He has seemed to have vanished into the woodwork, and so she's brought before this angry crowd where Jesus is, and she becomes the basis of a trap, because they know that if he lets her off, he's being too lightweight about a serious sin against the law of Moses, and if he condemns her, he is being harsh, and he's being known as somebody who is loving and generous and expressing the love and generosity of God. So what will he do? He's completely cornered, they think. He's completely cornered by the sin of this woman. Now, in some manuscripts, this story isn't here. It's in other places in the manuscripts. But the reason it's here is because it so brings you into the presence of what Jesus was like. You can see why the early scholars put this in place and knew that this was the genuine Jesus. Here it is. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down, like a rabbi, sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees, that's very important, the people who knew the law and the Pharisees who were devout followers of the law, brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. And Jesus knew that very well. He saw what was in people straight away. And so he does nothing. He's sitting on the floor and he puts his finger forward and he starts to doodle in the dust. And it drives them crazy. He bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he said, "Come on, what do you think? Come on." He straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the one who casts the first stone." And then he sits down again and starts to doodle on the dust again. People make a big deal about what he was doing. Some people said he was writing down the Ten Commandments, which you could do with your finger in the dust, in Hebrew script or Aramaic script, and you're writing down the Ten Commandments, and he's saying, "These are the rules. Have you kept them? Have you kept them?" Or he could just be drawing penguins. It doesn't really matter. He is deflecting them from their confrontation of him and this woman, and he's taking the steam out of the situation. He's making them wait and think. And the real word that you're allowed to hear that he said to them was, "Are you really on the moral high ground? Are you without cause for anybody to condemn you? Are you without sin?" In fact, there was only one person in the crowd who was without sin, and that was Jesus himself. He was the only one who was able to condemn the woman, because everybody, if they look into their own hearts, you're aware, aren't you? Come on, just put your hand up if you've never done anything wrong. You're aware, aren't you, that you've been a scumbag, that you've done bad things, that you've had bad thoughts and gone in a bad direction. And who are you? Jesus said many times in different ways, "Do not judge. Judge not, lest you be judged." Are you really in a position to point a finger at any other human being and say, that person deserves to die for their sin? Are you ever in that position? So Jesus forces this analysis of the situation while he's doodling in the dust. And it says, at this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the oldest first. I don't know why it says the oldest first. Maybe they're the ones who'd committed the most sins. Maybe they're the most self-aware. And you think, "Oh yeah, well, I'm not getting out of this one." Can you imagine the arrogance of the person who stands there with his stone and he's looking around? What? And they're all going away. I am not going to stand before Jesus who's looking at me and say, "I am without sin. My conscience is completely clear. So they all go away. And Jesus is left with the woman still standing there. Still standing there. In the Greek, it has an interesting little bit. It says, still standing in the midst. Is it in the midst of what? They've all gone. It's in the midst of the accusations. She's standing in the midst of the accusations. All these angry voices are ringing round the air, and Jesus has kept the temperature. He's brought it right down. He's saying, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? And she says, no one, sir. So he says, so neither do I condemn you. And then he says, go now and leave your life of sin. Now very quickly, this is radical grace. This is absolute, the confrontation of clear, obvious sin with clear, obvious forgiveness. And it's radical. It's almost terrifying that God could look squarely at sin and say, you're free. You're free. But there's lots of other things going on here, but I'll just give you three thoughts that come out of this passage. One is a plea for understanding. We have to understand that whenever somebody sins or gets into what Jesus calls a life of sin, the first thing you have to do is not pick up a rock, but try to understand. Do you agree? To think why they are the way they are, why they are where they are. So the first thing is a plea for understanding. I think that Jesus was forcing them to think about the situation before they acted. And the second one is the gospel. It's a radical call and offer and declaration of the way that God feels about us. That even though we are in sin, even though we are caught out in sin, we can be forgiven. We're offered forgiveness. But the third is serious as well. It's a summons to obedience. It's saying, go and leave your life of sin. You have been forgiven, but don't, you've been brought out of the mud and you've been given a white suit, but don't go jumping back in again, mate. You've been freed, you've been rescued, you've been forgiven, but now leave your life of sin. So all these things run together, and this is one of the most significant and important of the encounters of Jesus, because it shows to us just what the gospel does and is. Do you hear it? Amen. God bless you today.